Welcome to our panel discussion, Faith and Politics, How Christians Can Faithfully Engage in a Fractured Public Square. We wish to thank Union Presbyterian Seminary for sponsoring today's forum. A few notes before we start. Use the chat feature to ask questions. This webinar is being recorded. If you registered, you'll receive a link to the recording within 24 hours. Our panelists are Dr. Samuel Adams, Professor of Biblical Studies and editor for the journal Interpretation at Union Presbyterian Seminary, and the Reverend Amy Starr Redwine, pastor and head of staff at First Presbyterian Church in Richmond, Virginia. Our host and moderator is Summer Jordan, a Master of Divinity student and moderator for the Black Caucus at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Summer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us and participating in this conversation today. Let's get started with that first question. So there's an old adage that politics should not be discussed in church. However, people in the biblical narrative encounter with political figures and systems of governance. Is there a line that, is there a line that can be traced through the biblical narrative in both the Old and New Testaments in our political engagement in the modern times? And Dr. Adams, would you like to take this question and start us off?
Yeah, I can start. I'm unmuted. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, really an honor to be participating in this with you, Summer. I've really enjoyed getting to know you as a student at Union, and I'm delighted about this opportunity. And also want to thank my friend Amy Starr Redwine for her willingness to participate. So obviously these are important questions, and the election is on everyone's mind on this rainy Friday in Richmond before November the 3rd. I guess I think it's a really important thing to note that, yeah, absolutely there are we can trace lines in this regard. One of the interesting things, if you go to the United States Capitol, is that some of the sculptures that have been put in include a sculpture of Moses as a lawgiver, Moses as one of the ancient figures whose law code is instrumental for thinking about jurisprudence, righteousness, and what it means to enact a fair society. We can look at places like Exodus and Deuteronomy, Leviticus, where we have developed law codes. We can look at the prophetic figures who speak to whether those laws and principles are being filled out by the people, whether justice is being enacted, whether the poor are being tended to. And then, of course, Jesus works in that exact same tradition. He is, as much as anything else, a legal interpreter of Torah. He engages in dialogue about whether the law is being adhered to, whether there is fairness in the world, and whether people are loving their neighbors as themselves. And all of these are inherently political questions and political issues. And so absolutely we can trace that line. I mean, there's a lot we could say about the quote unquote separation of church and state, but both the Bible and the tradition of which we are a part are important conversation partners as we think about our current political context.
Well, I appreciate, Summer, that you sent that first question to the biblical scholar here. And I'm really grateful to be here with you, Sam, and appreciate the invitation. And it's been good to meet you, Summer, and get to know you in this forum. And, you know, I would absolutely agree that there is a line of political engagement, and I think in the Bible, throughout the Old and New Testaments, and I think it's one that can help us try to make sense of not just the moment that we're in, but the larger role of how politics is an integral part of our lives and our life of faith. So one way that I, just try to think about it sort of from a very high level is that the word politics comes from the Greek polis, which is the affairs of the city. And, I think the texts and the stories that Sam pointed to, particularly in the Old Testament, as the Israelite people were kind of learning what it meant to live in a community that was shaped by these laws of God. And of course, the 10 Commandments that God gave Moses were kind of divided into, two parts where some are focused on our relationship to God, and others are focused on our relationship with our fellow human beings. And I think that kind of forms the foundation for God's people, of how to understand how politics is a part of their lives and their life of faith. And then, I think about the fact that Jesus himself was so much a part of the political moment that he lived in. I mean, from the things he said that were so offensive, not only to religious leaders, but to the Roman leaders who were there. And then, of course, the fact that he was executed by the state. I think we certainly need to see Jesus as a political figure. And although he was making theological statements that I always like to think of Jesus as an equal opportunity offender. He's kind of managed to offend everybody at some point, but they were statements with political implications. And I think that's important for us to realize.
Thank you. Those are such thoughtful answers. And I think it's a good segue into our next question. So many people are of the mind that faith and politics should be separated. And there's also an idea that people should vote their conscience, which is another way of saying vote your faith. So how would you describe the intersection between personal faith and politics? Reverend Adams, I'll start with you.
Thanks. These are obviously huge questions, and certainly one of the hallmarks and greatest features of our country is the allowance of religious freedom, that people are free to practice whatever faith tradition they want or none at all. And I don't think any of us would want to do anything to threaten that, who are participating in this conversation this morning. Nevertheless, so that is definitely a given. But there's also a sense in which you hear, and I know Amy hears this as well. Statements made to the effect that politics doesn't belong in church, or my faith and my politics are separate. And we've already discussed the fact that the Bible is an inherently political document, that it deals with, a whole bunch of issues and questions that, as Amy was mentioning, are tied to the type of society we're going to set up, how we're going to look after each other or not. And there's a great deal of social commentary in the Bible on that. So any statement, I will have people come up to me after preaching or doing an adult ed and sort of saying, well, my faith and my politics are completely separate. It shouldn't be brought into church. It doesn't mean we can't have honest disagreements about the pressing questions of our day. We will, and we should debate those respectfully and honestly. I would hope and believe that faith and politics are intertwined, as they always have been in American political history. If you look at what in my judgment is the greatest speech ever offered by an American leader. From my perspective, that would be Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. And if you go and you read that, you will see that his faith, his engagement with Scripture, they underscore every line that he is offering at one of the most desperate and tragic moments in our country's history. And because of his faith, we were able. Or one of the primary reasons we're able to rise again from that tragedy was because of his faith and the faith of others. The notion. So faith and politics are always going to be intertwined, I guess I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree, Sam, and appreciate you bringing up Lincoln's second inaugural, because I think that's a great example. And I think it also is an example of something that I've been thinking about, and honestly, I've really been concerned about. I mean, there's so much to be concerned about in this particular election season. But I do think this idea that keeps surfacing, especially for those of us who work in the church or like in seminary and theological education, of what is the intersection of faith and politics. And even the graphic that was up at the beginning of the road signs of faith and politics. And I've used that graphic before to talk about it in church. So I appreciate it, but I actually think it's misleading, and that we need to do in the church and in our, halls of theological education, I think we need to do a better job of helping people recognize that faith and politics are not just two sides of the same coin. I think our faith needs to be the coin. I think our faith needs to be what helps us make sense of the world that we live in and of the lives that we lead. And politics is a piece of that. But I think maybe one thing that might help us in this moment, and as we try to go forward from this election, because I think we all know, as much as we want the election to be over, whether or not it's over on Tuesday, these issues that have been so contentious are going to still be with us. So how can we see politics as kind of a piece of what it means to be human, to be a citizen of a particular country, but that our faith is kind of what is the ultimate foundation of our lives that helps us make sense of politics. We've sort of alluded to this, but people have certainly said to me in every church I've served, politics has no place in church. And I just really feel like that's a misunderstanding. And I certainly agree that partisan politics, I believe, does not have a place in church, especially in a church that is, clearly committed to a diversity of views. But politics, in terms of, again, that definition of the affairs of the city, absolutely God calls us and has always called us to care about the communities we live in, about the people that are our neighbors, whether they are in the pews with us or not. I don't think God makes that distinction. And, one text that I think has been helpful here is when you get these folks, I think it's the Herodians and the Pharisees who come to Jesus and they say, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And they're trying to trap him. And of course, he manages to elude the trap. He asks them to bring a coin with Caesar's face on it. And he asks them whose image is on the coin, which I think is a real allusion to the fact that human beings are created in the image of God. And his answer is to give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give to God what belongs to God. Well, what belongs to God is nothing less than everything. So I think that is a way, again, of kind of reframing that idea that, politics and faith should be sort of two separate things. And I hope that might be one way for us to kind of move forward, is to see them as not on the same level.
Well, thank you. You definitely gave me a new perspective and way of thinking about how the coin thing with Caesar on its face on the side, and how we are a reflection of God's image, and that it was interesting. Thank you for that. And also themes of civility and caring for our neighbors came up. So I think a good question to come next is, many Christians think that civility is disappearing from our political discourse. And others think that civility is just code for maintaining an oppressive status quo. So what does civility, does it have a role in our faith and politics? Reverend Amy Starr Redwine, I'd like to take this to you.
Sure, thank you, Summer. And I'm really grateful for this question, in part because I have started to think about civility a little bit differently. And certainly at the beginning of this fall, and even trying to plan for this fall. And of course, we're in such a, kind of unbelievable season with the pandemic, and that has changed so much about the ways that churches are operating. And it's certainly changed the way that the church I serve has operated. But in the midst of that, also knowing the challenge of being church in this election season. And our staff gave a lot of thought to that. And we decided to do a sermon and education series on how to have hard conversations. So we've been looking at biblical stories of people having conversations about contentious topics. And, one of the things I've actually observed is that sometimes there is a real lack of what we like to think of as civility, which I think sometimes we think of just as niceness, like it's being nice. It's not, it's being respectful, which I think is critically important. We've labeled these conversations that we're talking about good faith conversations. And, that's maybe a different kind of conversation than a conversation that's a debate, for example, or something like that. But although you would hope that those would happen in good faith too. But, again, one thing I've noticed is that some of the people who come to Jesus do so with a remarkable lack of civility. They are described in the text as shouting over and over again. There's a couple of examples where someone is crying out for Jesus to heal them or heal their child. And it seems like, and this is where I think sometimes it's hard when we're reading black and white words on a page for the emotion and the actual, sort of the sensory elements of those stories to come through. But if you really think about what that would have been like, and there's a couple of occasions where the disciples are actually trying to quiet down these people who are crying out to Jesus. But I think what this points to is sometimes what unnerves us and what we label as uncivil comes because there are people who, in our particular, the way that we have structured our society, have a real hard time getting their voices heard. And I think civility as a concept can sometimes be used to kind of shut that down, or say, we are not going to listen to your point of view if you can't say it in this certain way. And the reality is that those of us who have been served well by our political system have an easier time, having a platform to speak and have our voices be heard. And I certainly know as a parent that when a child is not being listened to, they don't get nicer. They get louder. And they get more and more insistent, even infants, it's crying babies that let us know that they have a need. And I really think that, is sometimes at what is at play. And that I think we need to think about that before we just write it off as, well, that is not civil behavior. And we don't have to listen to it unless it is coming to us in a certain, cloaked in a certain way. So that's one way I would answer that. And I don't want it to be seen as that civility doesn't have a place, because then I think the reality is, if we're going to have meaningful conversation and change, we're going to have to be able to do that in a way that different opinions can be heard, can be listened to, can be responded to. But that's not always the place we can start. I guess maybe I would put it that way.
Just still processing and thinking about Amy's brilliant and really insightful answer, because I think she's really forcing me to rethink a lot of aspects of this. I've done a fair amount of thinking about this, and especially as it relates to the Bible. We as we often do, we sometimes have competing visions that we find from the Bible about this topic. And let me just unpack that for a minute. In the book of Proverbs, for example, there's calls for measured, careful, deliberative speech, where you really have to think about what you're going to say. You should say it carefully. You should be honest. You shouldn't be hot-headed about it. And so there's a real call for civility there, with careful attention to controlling the tongue. This is picked up in the New Testament, in the Epistle of James, in a famous passage in chapter 3. So we do have that strand in the Bible. And I do think there is a place for civility that there has to be a place for civility that has, and it's been threatened in our current landscape. There's so much shouting and vitriol and anger on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook. But also, I mean, I think that something is lost in terms of progress. If school board meetings, city councils, legislative bodies degenerate into shouting matches where civility is absent, and it gets in the way of meaningful progress in terms of legislation or trying to find common ground on issues that are affecting communities. So, we have this strand in the Bible that is important, and I do think it needs to play out in many ways today. Yet, to Amy's point, and to look at another strand, there are prophets in the Old Testament. There is Jesus in the New Testament who had no patience for social injustice, who felt that they needed to shout from the rooftops that they were finding things happening, particularly mistreatment of the poor, about which, and racial injustice, about which they had to speak fervently and passionately, without any call for civility. And if we think about how this plays out today, I think of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, when he's accused of being an extremist. And he says, was not Jesus an extremist for love? Was not Amos an extremist for justice? And in that sense, calls, and one of the recurrent theme in that letter is he's sick of white moderate ministers calling him an extremist and encouraging him to engage in civility. And so I do agree with Amy, and I do agree with the question that oftentimes it is an effort to perpetuate an unjust status quo. And yet we need both in our society today. I don't, if I could just take that just a little bit further, I'm not interested in calls for civility, nor are those who are on the front lines when there's, more than 500 kids separated from their parents at the Mexican-American border. I'm not interested for calls for civility when I listen to Dr. Barber talk about his Poor People's Campaign and the number of Americans who don't know where their next meal is going to come from. So, I do think that it's a complicated question, but, increasingly I find myself, and I know others do as well, attuned to the need for prophetic speech as well as calls for civility.
Yeah, and if I can just jump back in on that, I'm reminded, Sam, of a sign that I've seen in some of the protests that was new to me. I'm sure it's not new, it was new to me, but we're probably all familiar with the no justice, no peace mantra, and I was familiar with it as NO, justice, no peace. But the one that was newer to me was the KNOW, that if we know justice, then we will know and have peace. And I think, that's an important concept to think about when we think about this notion of civility. And I'm so glad, Sam, that you brought in the prophets, because I think that is just another great example of people who kind of recognize the injustice to a point where they simply cannot kind of be quiet about it. There is an urgency around it. And of course, we have seen that in our country historically. There are these moments where there is kind of a groundswell of new calls for justice. And it is one of the ways that we have been able to move forward as a country, is to sort of ride those waves. And they often come with a certain amount of what we might label incivility, because they're loud and they're disruptive. And sometimes there is literal destructiveness that is a part of that. And I don't think that is necessarily what we think of as, or what I might think of as the sort of productive incivility. But I do think that it's helpful to think about, we don't want to be sort of cavalier in our calls for civility, because sometimes, again, that can be a way to try to silence the voices of those who are saying things that frankly make us uncomfortable, that we don't want to have to think about, because sometimes that's how civility is used. But again, I also totally agree that we need a baseline of civility, especially at the level of, where we're going to make policy, our government. I mean, I think that's the other thing we've seen, is that the breakdown of productive governance and conversation, especially at the national level, is bad for everyone. It's bad for everyone.
Absolutely. I mean, we've had, I don't think, now, wherever people come down on the political spectrum, it is a sign of dysfunction that the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the President haven't met this year.
Oh,
I mean, that's happened. If we could bracket the election for a minute, I think just as we think about where we are today, to use another biblical ancient term, we've reached what is sometimes referred to as a kairos moment. Kairos means appointed time, a time in which the sign for this podcast webinar has faith in politics. But it seems to me that we're at a crossroads in our country and in the world, especially in our country. And I think that's over two primary things right now. One is a reckoning over systemic racism that we have never confronted as fully and honestly as we might, as we should. And that has been a series of events, including some tragic and just senseless, inexcusable deaths. Have I think brought that to the surface in a way that should have happened a long time ago. I guess the other thing I would point to is the pandemic. The fact that we seem as a country to be incapable of coming together to address it. That sort of we've reached a kairos moment where we have to decide. And again, I'm bracketing what happens on Tuesday from that. How are we going to address these two things? And how are we going to do it in a way that leads to progress? Or are we going to do it in a way that leads to progress? And I think those are unanswered questions. But it seems to me we are at a juncture similar to where we were in the mid-'60s when we faced a set of questions about who we were going to be as a nation and as a people. And these questions of civility, prophetic speech are all part of that equation.
Yeah, one way that I have a mentor who has talked about this time in a way that I found really helpful, which is to say that it has both accelerated and revealed a number of different trends. There are trends that were already at work and at play before the pandemic and before this latest sort of racial reckoning, but it has really accelerated those and pushed, I think, all of us, and pushed our culture to see them and deal with them in a way that we haven't. And also that it's revealed some of the underlying inequalities, inequities that I certainly think we knew were there, but we've had to look at them in a different way. And I agree, Sam, that it is a real opportunity if we can, grasp it. And that's going to be the challenging part, because it also risks sort of driving us further apart.
Thank you. You both have such vast perspectives. Really gets the brain going and rolling in thought process. We're going to go to a question from our audience. So it says, the garb of religion is the best cloak for power. And that's a quote by William Hazlitt. With this in mind, how can Christians leverage their power for the common good? Or is it impossible? And Dr. Adams, I'd like to take it to you first.
That's an excellent question. And often that is true, and has been true throughout human history, that the garb of religion has been used as a cloak for power in a variety of different cultural contexts. I don't know that I would frame it or respond to it by saying Christians should seek to, quote unquote, leverage their power. I don't think that's certainly not the way I would think of it, and necessarily the way I think we should think of it, especially as we are in such a pluralistic context. My street in Henrico County, it's a wonderful, there's a rabbi on my street. There's a couple of people who are, who consider themselves Hindu or Buddhist. And it's really a patchwork of what America is right now. And I think we want to be respectful of that. At the same time, I would sort of frame it, how can Christians bring their faith to bear for the common good, is the way I would sort of want to think about it. How can we bring, and just coming back to Amy's sort of understanding that faith is not, and politics are not different sides of the coin. Your faith is the coin. It should represent who you are and what you bring. And so I guess I would say there is it seems to me that within Christian tradition, there is an impetus for mutual solidarity that we have to lift up as important for us, as common people. One of my favorite sections of the Bible is after Jesus is ascended to heaven, and the apostles. This is the Greek word we see a lot is koine or koinonia. They create a fellowship of believers, and if someone is in need, if someone falls into hard times, or if someone is struggling with illness, they're obligated to help each other out. And it seems to me that is and has been a real hallmark at its best in how Christianity has been practiced in the United States and elsewhere. And so I think we have to harness that in wonderful ways by working with local nonprofits, by engaging in there's so many ministries that Amy's church and others are involved in that build up the common good of our community. And I think we have to engage in that sort of spirit of koinonia and fellowship. In so doing, we will not just build up the body of Christ, but we will also make our communities better in a non-judgmental way, and in a way that's not hegemonic or power-driven. And I think one of the real hallmarks of the Reformed tradition and the Presbyterian Church in particular is that we seek to be transformative agents in our communities without telling everyone that they're wrong or that they're going to hell or that their theology is bankrupt. We try to do it in a way that is both respectful and sort of seeks to be in dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sam, I agree with so much of what you said. And I do think it's kind of an interesting, it's interesting to think about the idea of leveraging power. I have really appreciated Brene Brown's work on power because she distinguishes between or among power over, power for, and power with, in helping us think about the different ways that power can be used. And I think if we are envisioning power as power over, which is often what we think of when we think of power, that it's sort of a hierarchical kind of thing, then it can be leveraged in some really negative ways. And I think in the history of not just our country, but in the history in world history in general, we've certainly seen that happen. But I totally agree. And I love that you brought up the idea of koinonia, Sam. I think what we have in our tradition, and particularly in the early Christian tradition, in the earliest Christian communities before Christianity became aligned with the state, right? We had groups of people who really depended on one another for their safety and security and their well-being. And so I think, at a time, and this is because of our increasingly diverse and pluralistic society, it's less and less true that being Christian kind of automatically confers a sort of power. But I do think that there is, part of what we are called to do as Christians is to leverage the power with others and power for. So, one of the ways that we try to think about it at First Presbyterian Church here in Richmond is that the idea of discipleship is really this finding this balance between kind of faith formation and being educated in the Bible and in theology and outreach and going out, getting out of the walls of the church and actually being with God's people and serving God's people and recognizing that when you're there, you're going to be learning and your theology is going to be informed and challenged, and that it's this constant kind of back and forth between these two things. And I think, thinking about being out and with God's people and using our power, however we might understand that, to encourage and serve others is the way that I would hope we might be able to think about using power for the common good. But that's a great question, and it is very interesting. And I do think it's also important to recognize that religion can, without a doubt, be used as kind of a tool for power over, for sure.
Thank you. So another question I think is good to bounce off from what was just said. Romans 13 verses 1-7 says every person should place themselves under the authority of the government. Given that statement of the following verse, this is, how and when should people of faith place themselves in a position of political resistance? So the verses continue on to say, so anyone who opposes the authorities is standing against God and the authorities that have been put in place by God. And they're standing against what God has established. And people who take this kind of stand get punished. The authorities don't frighten people who are doing the right thing, but rather they frighten people who are doing wrong. So based off of that, how should Christians or people of faith in general put themselves in a position of political resistance? Reverend Amy Starr Redwine, do you have any?
I was waiting for you to
Hey,
take that
Amy,
one.
you take that one.
Yeah, that is a challenging one. Although I think it's important one to grapple with, and certainly I think that is one that as as the citizens of a democracy where we are taught in some ways to not just take what is, coming from our government as, kind of coming from on high and that's all there is, but to challenge it and to question it and to, be thoughtful about it. I think this is something that is important. But again, I would go back to this idea that our faith is, as the foundation for the lives that we lead. There are and have been throughout history governments that have, I think, clearly violated certain tenets of our religious tradition. Found in both the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And, much of what Jesus did was to challenge not just the civil government and the civil laws, but the religious leaders and the religious laws, and to say, to offer a new way of understanding the laws that had become so strictly interpreted that they had really become oppressive to God's people. And I think that's one of the things that Jesus pointed out. So I do think that might be one way that we can think about when we should place ourselves in political resistance is have politics been set up in such a way that they are clearly counter to some of our theological values and beliefs. And, I certainly think that is the case when there are groups of people who have been marginalized and oppressed through the laws of our country, and that potentially violates us seeing them as having been made in the image of God. So that's one example that I might give. Hoping Sam has some more light to shed on this.
I think that's very well stated. I think we have to go back to the context for Romans and acknowledge that it was a tricky thing for the Apostle Paul to write a letter to the church in Rome and negotiate the imperial dynamics of speaking to believers in the cradle of empire, who were and trying to figure out how he should talk about, and the whole idea of believing in a transcendent God and how Jesus and Paul think about the relationship between empire and community. It's all really complicated questions, but as Amy said, there have been far too many examples throughout history of governments and leaders who have used this as an excuse for totalitarianism. Mm-hmm. And that's not what Paul is talking about here. He's saying that God is part of what happens in human events, and that even so, we have to be careful and remember that Paul was beaten up a lot. He was thrown in prison. He engaged in resistant acts so that he and fellow believers could worship Jesus. His perspective is hardly bourgeois or complacent. And so, too often we see Romans 13:1 and 2 sort of thrown out there as examples of how and why we should be completely allegiant to the state. And I think we have to look at all of Paul's writings in this regard, and not engage in proof texting or eisegesis in thinking about this, because his perspective, I think, is a good bit more nuanced than that. We could go into the weeds of how Roman imperial structures worked, but that's not really what we're here to talk about today.
Thank you. So I want to go back to an audience question. So this one says, institutions as well as individuals have roles to play in the arena of faith and politics. What role would you suggest specifically for theological institutions like UPSEM or churches like First Presbyterian? How might such faith institutions help better encourage and model what MLK called the beloved community in the public political space? And Reverend Amy?
Yeah, what a great question. And I would go back to maybe what I said in the beginning, which is kind of my fervent hope for both theological institutions and churches, which is to really seize the task of helping people to think and live theologically, and to do that in such a way that people can kind of think about their theology as all encompassing. And so, I think that we are really challenged, and I would say this is particularly true in the church. And I don't know how much I really was helped to think about this in my seminary education, and I didn't go to UPSEM, so. But this, what I've come to realize is, the church often has people's attention for such a small slice of like a given week. Maybe people come to worship for an hour. Maybe they also attend an hour-long Bible study or Sunday school class. But when you think about that in the context of the rest of their lives, that's just not a lot. And so it's a big task for sure to try to help people, kind of understand and create or establish this sort of theology out of which they do their Monday through Friday, or of course, work is rarely that defined anymore, but do the job that they do, or, kind of shepherd their family life, or live as a political person and be engaged in the world and in politics. But I do think that theological institutions, that we need to give some real thought to this role, not that we aren't already, but I think that how we do that needs to change, because it feels to me like we're still doing it in many ways the way that we did decades ago. And this is a different moment. And certainly technology, and I will say, I think it is one of the great gifts of this last 8 months that the church has sort of made this enormous leap technologically out of necessity, because we have had to. But I think that is one of the things that will actually help us. And as far as, encouraging and modeling this idea of the beloved community, my fervent hope has been that the church can be the place, even if it is the last place that exists in our culture, where people who don't agree about everything politically can still come together and agree about theology and about God's care for the world, God's love for the world, and God's call to us to share that care and love with God's world and with all people. And I think being able to be a place where that can happen meaningfully is one of the great gifts that the church can give the world. But it's not easy. And I think that pastors and other church leaders could really benefit at the level of theological education from some real formation around how to do that.
Really helpful, and appreciate Amy's answer and President Blunt's really just insightful and question that is one we need to think about. I think just continuing to have forums, spaces conversations both within our institution, but especially outside of it. I mean, with both insiders and outsiders that take up difficult theological questions, pressing social, cultural, justice issues, in ways that are both honest and pointed. And I think UPSim has done a good job of that with the creation of our 3 centers in having these forums. I think we need to continue to do these types of events, having the seminary for a day, types of workshops with ministers and things like that. That provide spaces for these conversations. I think we need to be sure when we do these events that we're bringing in a variety of perspectives, and that we're listening to each other as well as we might. I'm teaching a course this semester on the Bible and politics, both past and present. And one of the things we're really trying to do in that class is to bring in diverse perspectives. And so, I think that is important. I would say, in terms of both how it works at seminary and church, we have to continue to engage theology in the Bible in this regard in ways that are honest and allow others into the conversation. And if I could pay a compliment, I think Amy, in her Purple Church, in her preaching, in her conversations with the Bible, in her establishment of mutual trust with that congregation, is doing it as well as anybody in the Presbyterian Church right now. And I really mean that. I really mean that. I mean, she is able to speak out and to touch on difficult issues, and to do so both in conversation with her church, her parishioners, and the Bible in a way that has a continual conversation, but is presses them, and she doesn't apologize in certain cases for where she comes down, but at the same time she leaves space for alternative perspectives, and I think that is important, and it's a very difficult thing to do. The last thing I would say about that regard, this is somewhat related to Brian's question, but just as we think about having these conversations, one thing that we're missing that I think would help is if we could all recover a bit of a sense of humor. And I don't mean laughing at others or laughing at serious situations. I mean our ability to laugh at ourselves and to have a good time sometimes as we have conversations. We haven't brought up President Trump, but that's probably a good thing. But he and some other national leaders seem incapable at laughing at themselves ever. Yeah. And it seems to me that if we could recover a sense of humor, that would be helpful. Sometimes when I'm speaking or preaching, there's a great book out that talks about this. It's called Prophecy Without Contempt. And it sort of says, rather than thinking of ourselves as Amos or some great figure, we should, be able to laugh at ourselves and think of ourselves as Jonah, who doesn't fully understand God's ways and is sitting on the edge of Nineveh with a sunburn over our heads, and sort of realizing that, we don't have the keys to the kingdom, and maybe a bit of self-deprecation, humility, and a sense of humor might allow us to be a better beloved community. I mean, one of the things Dr. King was really able to do was both he and the other leaders during that period were able to at opportune and appropriate times to have a sense of humor.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great point, Sam. And I think you are so right. We probably need that as much now as we ever did. And I think what is so important about having a sense of humor is, in some ways, I think it is the same thing that allows us to be open enough to change our minds when that becomes something that we need to do. It's sort of that same holding things a little less tightly. And I know we're in our last few minutes here, but this is such a rich question. And I think a couple of things that Sam's comments made me think about. One thing that I do think churches and institutions need to do is to really think about how we educate our youngest, we call them in First Pres, our youngest disciples. And I think part of that is doing that very early work of kind of planting the seeds with them of what the beloved community looks like. And I think part of that is in terms of kind of the images that they see, and I think much has been made of sort of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus that's in a portrait in nearly every church, and which is most, definitely not what Jesus would have looked like given where he lived, but even just offering our children this expansive view of what God's community is, and that it's not an American community or a Southern community, that it's not tribal, it is global. And I do think that is really important. One of the things we talk about at First Pres is that we really don't want to teach our children things that they will have to unlearn at some point in their faith journey. And I think many of us have had that experience. So I do think that is one way that we can think about as theological institutions, how we talk about this community with the youngest among us, because they are our future.
Thank you both so much. I would just like to thank both of you for your thoughtful responses and your time this morning. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us. And now I'd like to send this back to Mike.
Thank you, Summer.
Thank you, Summer.
And thank you all for watching. If you registered for today's forum, please share your thoughts by taking a 2-minute survey that will be emailed to you at the end of the broadcast. Please join us again for our next panel discussion on racial implications of the 2020 presidential election, the United States as a Democratic Project, with panelists Reverend Dr. Aubrey Hicks, Dr. Stacy Floyd Thomas, Dr. Rachel Bard, and Sam Ziegler. This webinar will be Tuesday, November 10th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Watch your email for registration. We hope you'll join us then, and we hope you go out and vote. Enjoy the rest of your day.